What is up, guys? Fahir here from AwesomeTuts.com, and this is the last video in this tutorial series because I expect you to know how to create this game on your own by the end. And yeah, I'm just kidding. Anyways, the next thing that we want to do is make our player jump. Now, before we actually do that, I want to introduce a new concept called collision detection, because we will need to detect collision between the player and the ground in order to allow the player to jump, because if the player is in the air, we are not gonna allow him to jump. Now, how can we detect collision? Well, in Unity, we can detect collision a couple of ways. The first way is to go in our script, and this is the player movement script right here. At the bottom, right below our change direction, I'm gonna create void on collision enter 2D, which takes a collision 2D as a parameter, which I'm gonna name target. Now, what is all of this right here? Am I going crazy, teacher? What are you doing? You're a crazy teacher? No, just a second, let me explain. Now, this on collision enter 2D is already built in into mono behavior. When I say built in, I mean it is inherited from mono behavior. We talked about inheritance in our C# section, which means that it is already defined right here and we are inheriting from mono behavior. That means we can access this function, and it will be called every time we have a collision between two game objects. Now, it is written like this: on collision enter 2D, and takes a collision 2D parameter. Now, this target, this is my name. You can name it Carl, you can name it Kenny, you can name it, however you want to name it. I can name it like my name, but I usually name it as target. Now, one really important thing to know is that you need to spell this correctly. And let me show you what I mean. So if I use here print and I say collision has happened, and if we go back here in Unity and notice now in the console, so when I hit the play button, when the player touches the ground, we should see collision has happened. Bam, you see collision has happened. Player has touched the ground and we have detected collision. Now, what do I mean when I said you need to spell this correctly? If I type it like on collision with lowercase o, and I go back here, let me clear the console. And if I hit the play button now and the player falls down, nothing happens. Why is that? Well, the reason for it is because this function is not named like this. It is named on collision with capital O, C capital for collision, E capital for enter, and D capital for 2D. So it needs to be exactly like this, or otherwise it does not work as you just saw, because that's not the name. If I type it like this is not the name of the function that is predefined in mono behavior. This is our own function that we have now created here, and it's not being called automatically. What if we want to know if we have collided with the actual ground? How can we do that? Because right here, this right here will detect collision not only between the player and the ground, even if we touch another player. So if I go back here, let me duplicate the player and let me move this player below. So this player is below the top player. Notice what's gonna happen. But for this player, for the second one, let me turn off the player movement script so that we don't see this printed 2 times. So if I go back here and I hit the play button, bam, you see, actually we saw it being printed 2 times for some reason, but well, let me just clear the console, clear, and hit the play button. Yeah, again, we see it. I need to actually remove it for some reason. So let me remove it. I'm gonna remove the component from the lower player, so the one that is at the bottom. And if I hit the play button now, bam, you see, the first player landed on the second player and it says collision has happened. Now, how can we actually detect collision between the ground and the player? Well, for that, we can use the target parameter. Let me just clear the console, remove this player from here, and let me just use the target parameter. So I can say here, for example, if target.gameObject.name is equal to ground like this, now we are going to say here print, and I'm gonna say here collided with the ground. Now, this target parameter is the actual game object which we are colliding. So the other game object we are in collision with. The first game object is the one that carries this script. The one in the parameter will be, in our case now, the ground or the player or the enemy or the coin if we touch a coin, so on and so forth. And you see here target.gameObject.name. This is gonna give us the name of the game object. And you see here the name of the game object is the actual ground. So we named it ground right here, which means that we can test it like this. So we can pass the name right here. And if the name matches, then we have collided with the ground. Let us check that. So if I hit the play button, bam, you see collided with the ground. This actually works. But in most cases, you're going to use something called a tag. What is a tag? Well, if you select the game object, you see here in the inspector, you see the name right here, and right below it you have a tag, and it says untagged here, and it's a drop-down list. When you click on this drop-down list, you will have options here to select these tags that are already available. So we have respawn, finish, so on and so forth. But we can also click at the bottom here to add tag. So again, you click on the drop-down list, you click on add tag, and now you can write your own tags. You can click on this plus button right here, and I can create a tag called ground. And I can hit enter, and now it's saved. And I can select the ground itself, and now I can select the ground tag from the drop-down list. And here, instead of using GameObject.name, I can use GameObject.tag and test it if it's equal to the tag. If I go back in Unity and if I hit enter, bam, he collides with the ground. So this actually works. Now, I said there are a couple of ways to detect collision. What is another way? Another way is using something called a trigger. So if I say void on trigger enter 2D, which takes a collider. So collider 2D, which I'm also going to name target. Now this is the same thing as with on collision. On trigger also needs to be spelled correctly. So like this, it needs to be O capital for on, T capital for trigger, E capital for enter, and D capital for 2D. But this one does not take a collision 2D as a parameter. It takes a collider 2D. And also I'm gonna name it target. You can name it, I don't know, Bob, or you can name it Devil, however you wanna name it. Now, how does this work? Well, here I can say if target.tag is equal to ground, we are gonna do the following. So we're gonna say print, and we're gonna say collided, so collided with tag. Let's go and test it out and see what will this do. So if I hit the play button, when we fall down on the ground, nothing happens. So what is the problem? Well, the problem is the following. This on trigger only works if one of the two game objects we are colliding with, so be that the player or the ground, so one of the two game objects that are in collision need to be set as a trigger. What does that mean? Well, if you select, for example, the player, notice in his box collider 2D, you have some options. One of those options is trigger. You see here, when you hover over, it says whether the collider behaves as a trigger or not. If you check this checkbox, he will behave as a trigger. But also notice now, when we run the game and he falls down, we will see this being printed in the console, but we will also see another thing. So if I hit the play button now, you see collided with tag, but also we see what? The player has fallen down. You see the player, he has fallen down. We don't even see him. Let me just go here and rerun the game. And I'm going to go back into the scene view. So notice now in the scene view, you see the player has fallen down. He is falling down and, well, he will never stop until we stop the game. What is the issue here? Well, the issue is that triggers, when you check that with this is trigger, when it's checked, that means that the collider is not solid. It can pass through other colliders, but we can detect collision. As you can see, we can detect collision in on trigger enter. So my point is, if both colliders in the collision are not set to be triggers, so if they are not, this is trigger is not checked for the player and it's not checked for the ground, you then need to use on collision enter to detect collision. So you need to use on trigger enter to detect collision. If one of those has a trigger or this is trigger is checked, you can use on trigger enter, but that depends on what you want. So for example, in our case, we don't want the player or the ground to be triggers because then they will pass through each other. We need the player to stand on the ground. If you want to use on trigger, you can do it like this. So you can add one more. So you can add one more box collider on the player, for example, one more box collider, and then you can set this one to be a trigger. So now he has two. Player now has two. One is a trigger, another is not a trigger. But now we see that collided with tag is printed from on trigger enter, but the player is standing on the ground because other box collider is solid one and they can stand one on another. Now, probably some of you will ask me, okay, give me some examples. When we use is trigger and when not. For example, for coins, you want the coin to collide with the player, but you don't want the player to get stuck or be pushed away by the coin when he touches it. So you can use or set the coin is trigger and you pick it up right away. So that is one of the examples. And we will see some other examples through the course. Now, another way to detect collision is the following. I'm going to use here or right click on the player and I'm going to create an empty game object. So now we have another game object that is right here and I can move it right below the feet of our player. So here, right below the feet, let me just select the player and see where he is. So his collider ends somewhere around here. So here, and let me see what the game object is. So yeah, here, right below his feet, I can place this game object and I'm going to call him ground check position. What we need to do is go here inside of our player movement and I can create a public game object or public transform variable, which I'm going to call ground. So ground check position. And here in the update, we can do something like if physics 2d.raycast, and I can raycast. What is a raycast? Well, just a second, we will see that. So we want to raycast from position, and that's going to be our ground check position, dot position, in the direction vector 2 dot down, and the distance will be, let's say, 0.5, for example. And here I can simply type print, so print, and I can say collided with ground. Now let's see if this works, and I'm gonna comment these lines of code in on trigger enter also. So let's see if this works, and then I will explain line by line or part by part what is going on here. So when I hit the play button now, and when we go down, we have a null reference exception because yeah, I'm stupid and I did forgot to drag and drop this ground check position right here because it's a public variable. You see, it's a public variable that we are using its position to check if we are colliding with the ground. So you need to drag and drop this from here to here. And let me just hit apply so that these changes apply to the prefab. When I hit the play button now and go down, bam, you see collided with ground, and already all this time it is detecting collision in the ground or with the ground because we are calling this in the update function. Now, what is this? This raycast will draw a ray from this position in this direction, and this is the length of that raycast. So for example, if our player is this right here, so this is our player and this is our ground checker position. So we are using ground checker position. So from this position in vector 3 down, the direction is downwards and 0.5 is the length. So 0.5 is the length of this ray. So this is that length, 0.5. And whatever this line touches, it will detect collision with that other game object. Of course, in order to detect collision, that other game object need to have a collider. So it has a box collider, which is our ground. Now, you see here, because it's only down, it does not detect collision, for example, on this side or upwards. But our collider, so our collider, box collider, he will detect collision from the left, from the right, upwards, downwards. It's not important on all sides, he will detect collision. But this ray casting, it will only draw a small line below our player So from the position, which is this one right here that we have, well, ground check position that we have created, in this direction, which is down, so in the down direction, and this is the length of that line, so 0.5. If you write 20, then the length of that line will be 20 units. If you write 1 million, it will be 1 million. So this is that ray cast. So essentially, again, it draws a line, for example, like this. Let me just take the highlight tool. It draws the line like this. This is the length of the line, 0.5. This is the direction going downwards. And now when we go down, so let me just go here, clear, and hit the play button. And right here, where is my player? Come on, player, play. So let's go here, highlight. So it draws a line like this, and notice this line now is touching the ground. This line is touching the ground, which means it is detecting collision here with the ground. Now there is one other thing that we can do with this ray cast. We can use something called a layer mask. So if I go back here right below and I say public layer mask and I call it ground layer like this, I can add it here as a parameter. So I can say comma and add it here as a parameter. And if we go back here, if I select the ground, notice the ground has a tag right here called ground. We also have right next to it something called a layer. It is set on the default layer. If I select the player, you see now this ground layer is set to public, but it's set here to nothing. If I hit the play button and we go here, notice we are not detecting collision. Why is that? Well, because of this layer. This layer will serve as a tag because it will only allow this raycast to detect collisions with game objects that are on the specified layer that we click right here. So for the ground, I'm gonna go here and click add a new layer. So let me select it again, click on the drop down list, add layer, click on the plus, or actually here we don't have to click on the plus button, but here we are simply gonna type ground and hit enter. So now I'm gonna select the ground, go right here and add the ground layer to the ground. So now the ground is on the ground layer. And if I go and select the player here for his ground layer public variable, if I click on the drop down list, we can also select the ground. So if I select the ground, hit the play button, and now we go down, bam, you see now we are detecting collision. So we can use these layer masks, and let me just hit apply. So we can use these layer masks to filter the collision by using this raycast. So it will only detect this raycast right here, will only detect collisions with game objects that are on this specified layer. And the specified layer in our case is the ground layer. I know this was a whole lecture only about collisions, but I needed to differentiate and explain to you what are collisions and how we can use them, or actually now we're going to apply them in our real world projects and you will see that. But I wanted to introduce them like this so that you know, and I have tackled some important issues that I saw a lot of students have problem with, such as on collision enter not working, on trigger enter not working. In 1 or 99% of the times, you misspelled on trigger enter. You either wrote on trigger like this, or you wrote 2D like this, or something like that, and that's why it is not calling. And I also explained the difference between on collision enter and on trigger enter. So for on trigger enter, both colliders, or at least one of the colliders, needs to have is trigger checked, and on collision enter, well, for that you don't need is trigger to be checked. Anyways, this was about collisions. In the next video, we will make our player jump. Fahir here from AwesomeTunes.com. See you guys in the next video.